Welcome. My name is Alana Edwards, and I am Education and Engagement Coordinator at Surrey Art Gallery. I am coming to you from the gallery near the entrance to Mark Soo's exhibition, Twilight on the Edge of Town, on view until June 7th. Thank you for joining us today. The gallery is located on unceded Coast Salish territory, including that of the Semiahmoo, Kwantlen, and Katzie Nations. As I reflect on Mark's exhibition on themes of individual and collective memory and complex histories spanning and disrupting time and place, I think of the responsibility we have to land and to each other. The stories and memories that territory holds and that we hold as people. I am pleased to introduce Jordan Strong, Curator of Exhibitions and Collections, who will be moderating today's talk. Over to you, Jordan.
Hello, thank you. I want to begin today's artist talk with Mark Soo by recognizing the larger occasion for which we gather. Not only are we launching Mark Soo's newest exhibition, Twilight on the Edge of Town, we are also thrilled to be launching two other important exhibitions, a two-person exhibit called Delineations with Vancouver ceramic sculptor artist Gailan Gan and Surrey-based painter Marilyn Dyer. And we are also celebrating the presentation of Toronto artist Yam Lau's Hutong House, a 4.5-minute single-channel video installation in the other parts of the gallery space. So on behalf of the gallery, I want to thank all three of these artists for sharing their work with our audiences this spring. And more information about these exhibitions are available on our homepage and on our website. So Mark Soo. So Mark was born in Singapore in 1977, raised in Malaysia before moving to Surrey in the late 1980s and living in the Guildford neighborhood here just down the street from the gallery. He later moved to Vancouver to attend Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Art in 2001. After practicing in the Vancouver area for over a decade, Mark relocated to Berlin, where he currently lives. Moved to Berlin along with many other Canadian artists, of course, and continues to practice there today. And over his 2 decades of practice, Mark has worked in a variety of media, including photography, sound, and video, all of which he uses to investigate notions of presence, perception, modes of representation, and considerations of social space. His work draws on diverse sources ranging from art history to popular culture and social histories, and he has had solo shows in Vancouver, Berlin, London, and other cities around the world. Mark has his work in major public and private collections, including the National Gallery of Canada, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Walker Art Center, and others. And originally we had planned to exhibit this work now over a year ago, and then things changed with the world, and we have now delayed it, of course. And in the preparation for this exhibition, in many ways, the work has taken on even more significant meaning than it originally had when it was conceived. I think the resonances of the exhibition and the project are even more significant today. Its considerations of time, memory, and the past are very important in thinking about our current times. So before handing it over to Mark, I just wanted to end by saying that Mark was part of a group of artists and critics and curators in Vancouver who in 2004 gathered to talk about creating a new art magazine in Western Canada. And as we were sort of brainstorming and considering what we needed to create in the city at that time, Mark came up with the idea of this new art magazine, and the title was Costume. And we ended up going with a different title, but I think the word costume and really foregrounded in many ways the theatrical nature of Mark's practice, engagement with the boundaries between theater and cinema. And I think it speaks volumes to our current project here at the Surrey Art Gallery. So please welcome Mark Soo.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Jordan. That was really nice to hear about this anecdote of costume. I haven't thought about that in a very, very long time, so it's great. It's great to hear that. I wanted to kind of begin by just saying a very, 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 very big thanks to the Surrey Art Gallery and to Jordan in particular for inviting me to the exhibition. It's been long in the planning, and it's also taken a year longer, as Jordan mentioned, to present the work than we anticipated. But it's a really, really great privilege to be able to work with the Surrey Art Gallery and to work with the team there to be able to show this piece. I'm really thrilled about that. I'd also really like to give a shout out and a thanks to my production team with Verena Buttmann and Misha Amstad here in Berlin, and to Wade Thomas in Vancouver, and to other numerous people who've contributed to this artwork. Without these people, I would not have been able to produce this artwork. I'd also like to give a thanks to the Canada Council, who generously helped with the production of this artwork as well. Having said all that, as I mentioned, I'm really thrilled. I'm really happy to be able to present this work at the Surrey Art Gallery. And Surrey has a very special and important place in my life and in my art, because it's the first place that we lived in, or it's the place that I lived in, moving and immigrating to Canada. So it's a place that has sort of filled me with not only a lot of memories, but also a lot of imagination. And partially what this is for me was a really complicated and complex experience, because moving to Surrey and immigrating to Canada was as much about imagining what a new country was like, as much as it is about sort of recalling what the experience is. And that mixture of kind of imagination and anticipation, as well as recollection of this event, very much informs my experience of this time, and how I've sort of structured these kinds of memories, and in a sort of way what they really mean for me, and how they've kind of gone on to kind of inform my practice, and very much the things that I've sort of drawn on in making this artwork. So that kind of relationship to place has been an important one in the making of this artwork, and it's very much allowed me to think about how I've related to places, and I want to say that in a very kind of loose sort of sense, because a place is not only geographic and physical, but it's also very much located in other realms of experience, in tastes and smells and all kinds of all forms of human experience. Activating these kinds of experiences has been a very strong component of my artwork, and it's something that I feel is very important, how to kind of draw on the experience of the viewer themselves in understanding what an artwork can be and what the themes and issues an artwork suggests. So this artwork, Twilight on the Edge of Town, is very much in this vein. And I'll go on to kind of explain some of that a little later on. Just wanted to go back a little bit to my background. For those who don't know my work, I work very much with media, with photography, with moving images more and more. But I always work with them in the consideration of space and time. And what is really interesting to me is how media, these kinds of things that contain pictures, that contain words, that contain moving images, how these forms of media have been integral to how we've narrated our experience throughout the 20th century and the 21st. They've been kind of these containers that we put and ascribe human experience to. And like I mentioned before, they are as much full of the content of our lives as much as what we imagine them to be. And that kind of composite, that kind of hybridness is really key to the process that I work with. Twilight on the Edge of Town is, for me, a complex work of media. It touches on moving images. It doesn't use images that I've captured, but it definitely uses images that I've remembered. It uses images that I've fictionalized. And it uses them in a very kind of complex, at least for me, complex spatial kind of experience. And I'll go on to kind of explain that a little later on. I also want to kind of begin by just giving a little brief outline to some of the influences and things that I've thought about in making this artwork. I normally wouldn't tell people going to see this exhibition some of this stuff, but I think given the experience of artwork now within a kind of online sphere and how we kind of have to consider distance and remoteness, I think it seems a bit more appropriate to have forums where we can kind of provide some of this information. So I wanted to give a little brief overview of some of the things that I've thought about that have kind of occupied my mind while making the work before I show you the work. So Nathan, if we can go to the first slide, please. And this is a picture of a book that I read numerous times as I was kind of starting the artwork, Twilight on the Edge of Town. It's a book by Canadian poet Fred Waugh called Diamond Grill. Some of you might have read this. It's a book by Fred about the Diamond Grill, which is a Chinese-Canadian diner that he grew up in Nelson, BC. Fred is a poet of mixed cultural heritage, where he comes from both Swedish as well as Chinese background. And in the book, he kind of tells about this complex experience of identity and of place and of growing up within the context of the Diamond Grill and the restaurant. What's really interesting to me, as I kind of picked up the book again, was that, and if we can go to the next slide, Nathan, was something that I didn't quite expect. And on the back of the book, there's a little banner that said that the book was the winner of the 1997 Howard O'Hagan Short Fiction Award. And this caught me by surprise when I picked up the book, because it wasn't something that I anticipated. For a book that I had believed to be so much rooted in his biographical experience. And this was, seeing that it won an award for short fiction was a surprise, but it was a really, really, really nice surprise, because less than pointing out the untruthfulness of Fred's writing, what it pointed out was that memory and again, recollection is a composite both of lived experience as well as imagination, of writing and narrating, and recalling. And again, this sort of composite experience, this kind of melange of all these things happening at the same time, points to how we experience things on a very, very complex level, and how imagining something is as vivid and compelling as having lived through that. Fred goes on to talk about his cultural experiences as being very hybrid, of kind of encompassing both of these cultural spheres, of being both Chinese as well as coming from a Swedish background. And in his own poetry, he talks about the hyphen as a device, as a literary and a writing device that has helped him to kind of imagine what that kind of in-betweenness and what that kind of compositeness. A hyphen is just a very little sign, it's a dash that you put between two words to join them, to make them an entirely different object. And I really found that a compelling and really interesting idea, that such a kind of a common device, the hyphen, could be so powerful in joining separate ideas together. So throughout the book, I really had that in mind. And throughout the making of the work, this was a very key point for me. Nathan, if we can go to the next slide, that would be slide 3, please. I'll just kind of sketch through some other influences for me. Samuel Beckett was also a kind of a big influence in making this piece. And this is an image of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot play. It's a play where I think somebody said famously that nothing happens twice. And I think it's a kind of apt description. It's quite funny, but what was important about Samuel Beckett was how he kind of expanded the idea of theater, of media, and of time and duration, and expanded those categories for me. And those are very much things that sort of have gone on to inform the making of this work. There's another play that I don't have an image of that was really important for me, which was Krapp's Last Tape that Samuel Beckett wrote. And this was a very curious play, very well known, where a man uses media tapes to as a way to kind of reminisce and recall his past. And this combination of a person trying to remember his past, as well as playing it back on a tape of something that he recorded and used to kind of capture, let's say, his memory, is again this kind of composite, this hybrid condition of memory that has gone on to inform the work. Nathan, if we can go to the next slide, slide 4. Yet another book and that seemed to be a cornerstone for this artwork was William Gibson's Neuromancer. And for all those who know, the seminal book about cyberpunk, for the cyberpunk culture. And what was really interesting about Gibson's writing for me is that as much as it is a kind of dystopian, utopian icon for what the future might be, Gibson also often writes in a way that's very almost like a hard noir kind of detective hard-boiled story writing. So it recalls the past, and the way that those two ideas are joined, where the way that something that sounds like the past is imagined to be the future, is kind of a hallmark of his writing. And that's, again, another instance of a kind of composite experience that seemed to be really important. If we can go to the next slide, Nathan, that would be slide 5. As I mentioned, I think not just moving images or photography, but sound and space have been really key to the kinds of materials that I work with. And that's because I think they activate different levels of human experience that I'm interested in putting together within my exhibitions, within my artwork. And sound is one of those elements that is a very, very key and a very important way to provide information and to produce experiences. This is an image of Suzanne Ciani, and she's a synthesizer pioneer, American synthesizer pioneer. And what was interesting about a work that she made was, well, what she did, I think in the 1970s, was to score a Coca-Cola advertisement. And the Coca-Cola advertisement basically had a can opening up, and you would hear the can pop and you would hear the fizz of the Coca-Cola. And when they made the advert, they found that recording the live can was not as vivid and not as strong for people as synthesizing that sound using synthesizers. And Suzanne was a synthesizer specialist, and she recreated the fizz. So in a sense, the fizz is a kind of a synthetic object. But what we remember from the advertisement is this kind of very vivid sound. And again, something that was actually synthesized, that was realer than the real, seemed to be more effective at producing human emotion. And I talked to Suzanne about this at some point, and I found her response really interesting. But if we can cue the video or the sound clip, Nathan.
Coca-Cola Pop and Pour.
So there it is. That was the Coca-Cola Fizz that was entirely synthesized in the studio rather than recorded in the reel. That's been a kind of little strategy that I've gone on to use in many of my artworks. So having sort of said that, I want to now show you images from the artwork, but I also want to kind of explain that to you, to what you might see as a viewer. I spent a lot of time crafting the environment that holds these images and holds these multi experiential elements, and in a kind of way I'm not able to kind of experience it at this moment because of distance. So it's really interesting to kind of maybe try to explain that and tell that to you. Nathan, if we can go to slide 11, or sorry, slide 7. That's great, thanks. This is the opening scene in Twilight of the Edge of Town. When you go see the installation, what you encounter is a large space. And in that large space are 2 projection screens, and they're set up one behind the other. And they're really, really large and very, very immersive. And what you'll notice is that they're also see-through. When you stand in front of them, you are faced with 2 images, a foreground image and a background image. And when you look at them, they kind of merge together and they kind of split apart as you move around the space. Also in the space are 2, what you'll hear are 2 voices that are speaking to you simultaneously. There is on the left wall a voice of a child, and on the right wall there's a voice of an adult. And speaking over these images is the voice, are these 2 voices, and they talk over each other at the same time. And the image, what the images show are kind of images of a place. And as you can kind of see, it's the artwork is composed of animations, and they're composed of wireframe, what's called wireframe animations. They're kind of skeletal images that show made in 3D in a 3D rendering program. So they have this kind of very almost like 80s Tron vibe to them, but they're entirely kind of synthetic images, let's say. But they kind of, they go through a sequence of images that show this place. If we can go to slide 8, Nathan. And they're very much drawn from images that I've remembered of my time in Surrey, actually, of things that I might have seen and things that I also imagine seeing from my point of view today. But the images are very much composed of these kinds of memories. As I mentioned in the piece, there are these, you hear these 2 voices over the soundtrack. And what's interesting is that the child, the voice of the child, as you're watching those images, the voice of the child talks about things that he'd like to do in the future. At the same time that he's talking about that, the adult voice happening on the other side of the gallery space, there's an adult voice that talks about things that they've remembered. So simultaneously, they're talking about looking towards the future and recalling something from the past. And as a viewer, you're standing in front of these images. One is in the background and one is in the foreground, and you're trying also visually to assemble them. So you're kind of in this very precarious space where you're bombarded with information about the future and information about the past, and information that's in front of you and information that's very close to you. And this kind of spatial experience is very much at the crux of this piece. And it's a very difficult thing to try to explain. But I think when you're in the exhibition, it's something that is a very, very strong and a very direct kind of experience. I wanted to kind of run through some of the images and just give you a sense of what is composed in them, and to maybe talk a little bit about their background and what you might sort of see, and all this sort of in lieu of not being able to really show you images of the exhibition, or to kind of even have experienced it myself in the first hand. So we can go to image number 9, Nathan. So this kind of, this shows a very, this image shows the backdrop of a fence that you might kind of see in every backyard. And in composing these images for this piece, Twilight on the Edge of Town, I wanted to bring very kind of common elements, but to kind of put them out of time. And what happens is that the process of rendering these images in a wireframe gives you a sort of distance from familiar things. So a lot of these images are both composed of very familiar things, things like your backyard, things like trees or rocks, or things that you might already know. But the process of rendering them gives them a very unfamiliar presence. And that kind of tension between something that is very familiar and something that is at a distance away from you was part of an experience, part of the kind of human experience that I was also trying to get at in making this work. And that kind of closeness and that distance away from something is a very kind of abstract quality, but trying to translate that into how an artwork could make you feel was a really interesting and, I would say, very difficult kind of process as well, that went into trying to make this artwork. Nathan, if we could go to slide 10, please. Here's another image from the piece, and it shows just kind of objects that might be strewn around a backyard, something that you might see, and that might also trigger something that you might remember. One thing that I'd like you to imagine when seeing these images is that because the installation is composed of 2 screens, there's always another image, and there's always another image that this image reacts to. Right now, you just see, I'm only able to present one image, and I'm not able to present the other background image or foreground image. In the artwork, the 2 screens are set at a distance about 5 meters away from each other. And what that does is it forces the eye to try to focus on one screen at a time. Again, this is very hard to kind of explain without the exhibition behind me, or without actually having experienced the exhibition itself. But what I do know is it's very difficult for the eye to focus on 2 things at a distance simultaneously. So this distance, again, from something, and our ability to kind of focus on something, is very much part of the experiences that I wanted to generate in the work. And whether that's physically trying to experience 2 screens in synchrony together, and the difficulty that the human eye has in doing that, or whether it's listening to people talk, 2 people talk at the same time, one about the future and one about the past, this kind of difficulty in making this coherent is very much, again, another experience in the piece that I hope to generate, and that I hope that you'd be able to experience when you see this. Nathan, if we can go to slide 11. This is another image from the artwork, and it shows some foliage. And in the artwork, what I tried to capture, not just objects, but movement and certain kinds of movement. One of the things that is very uncanny is to see an object that's animated move in a very realistic kind of way. And in this artwork, I was able to kind of animate particularly shrubbery and trees and foliage in a very, very realistic kind of way. And the technology allows people working with computers to kind of generate this movement in a very, very compelling and lifelike way. And like the kind of Coca-Cola pop and pour sound where movement, where that sound is synthesized and is as vivid and maybe more vivid than what real life is, I think there's an element of technology that is starting to creep into human experience that starts to create these composite categories of what realism is. In the artwork, the foliage has this kind of movement, and it doesn't, I'll show some images later on, but it has this movement that allows us to kind of, that increases the believability of it, but at the same time, the images, this kind of wireframe images, gives us that distance. So this process of putting something very close again to us and at a distance from us is at work in all kinds of aspects of this place, of this artwork. Again, what I wanted to kind of stress on is that even as you see these elements in the artwork, the overall theme of what this place is and what these voices are narrating and where they are, and whether that might be far away from us and whether that might be really close to us, is the kind of is that quite at the crux of what I was trying to kind of get at with this artwork, where it might situate us and where it might sort of put us. And I have a kind of image that I found from the internet that I think maybe sets this into a kind of puts this metaphor into a different terms. If we can go to slide 12, Nathan. And this is a kind of found image that I got from the internet, and it shows this sort of, it's like a technical image of a sculpture of a woman turning around, but it's an optical illusion where you start to lose your sense of which direction the woman is or the sculpture is turning. And this kind of confusion of direction and of spatial cues, I think is really interesting when we transport that or transplant that onto other ideas like memory or like our experience of place, or what is it to be in this time. I think these kinds of experiences of turning in two directions at once, or trying to figure out in which direction we're going or which direction we're coming from, is a very important and interesting experience of place and history that I try to get to in all my works. I'd now kind of like to show you some video clips of some of the images that I've used in the artwork. And again, it's not in the installation context, so you don't get the full experience of what the sound is like and what it's like to kind of view them between these two screens. But I think it sort of captures something else. So I'd like to give you a little taste of that. Nathan, if you can cut to the next clip, and I'd like to let that run for a little bit. So what you see here is just a scene and a little bit of, if we can go to the next slide, please, slide 14. This image is an image of a flower, and what the clip shows is this sort of what I call this flower blooming, and it turns into this it looks like a flower, but it looks like a very kind of ends up looking like a very kind of alien flower. In the piece, as I said, there's this narration of this young boy and some adults. And if you listen to them talking, they seem to be talking from a point in perhaps in the future. And they talk about kind of technological developments. They talk about what the city is like. That's in a way that's very, very different from ours. But at the same time, you see elements and scenery and objects that might also be very familiar to neighborhoods all around the world, certainly to neighborhoods in Surrey. In the piece, I haven't sort of captured, or I haven't sort of stated where and what they might be, and in what period and time. And I've sort of left that open for the viewer to kind of try to piece that together. Nathan, if we could go to the next slide, 15, please.
I want to see what your face looks like again. Is it a real one?
Real to me now.
Is it a landscape? Do you have a big forehead? Does your nose look like a rock or a tree? My brother, 468B, he saw a face once. He told me he did. When he took out the garbage one day, it was there. And then it disappeared.
Everything.
That was another clip from Twilight on the Edge of Town, and you can hear the two voices interacting and speaking simultaneously. And again, the child talks about things that they would like to see, and the adult talks about things that they're trying to remember. And that happens simultaneously. That happens at the same time. In the gallery space, as a viewer, you're in between those two discussions. And what was interesting for me is that within the installation, you as a viewer are situated within the present, trying to listen to something that's going to happen and trying to listen to something that happened. And this sort of triangulation of positions and this kind of trying to hold that together, I think is a very interesting and very kind of challenging position to be in. This idea of the viewer trying to hold these things together, trying to keep this idea, this hybridness or this compositeness together, as I mentioned, is something that is runs throughout my artwork, and I think yeah, and it's something that I try to bring to every work that I make. I thought it might be a kind of good opportunity now just to kind of show you some of that past work and to let some of these themes kind of percolate throughout the rest of my practice. And so I'd like to kind of show you the next artwork of mine. If we can go to slide 16, please. This is a work that I made also in Vancouver, and very much about a place in Vancouver, and it's called Monochrome Sunset, English Bay, Oppenheimer Park. And it's an artwork I made about 2 locations in Vancouver, English Bay and Oppenheimer Park, and very much about my experience in both of these places and trying to think about their relation to one another and trying to how they might hold that relation together. The artwork is called English Bay and Oppenheimer Park, and it's composed of a large photograph of English Bay, that I photographed when the sunset was the same orange color as a set of streetlights that were used in Oppenheimer Park up to a certain point to kind of dispel or control drug use in the park. The lights are really orange and they're monochromatic. And if you're somebody standing under these lights in the park, when they had them in Oppenheimer Park, what you'd see is kind of a colorless landscape. And what was interesting is that the same orange in one location in Vancouver, in English Bay, is something that's used to draw people to a place. And that same color in a different location in Vancouver is used ostensibly to disperse people. So that connecting element gives us a very complex relationship to what that color can be and what the purpose of that color is within these 2 locations. But it makes this kind of, again, this kind of complicated composite experience of that color. If we can go to the next slide, slide 17. This is another artwork that I made that might use similar kinds of means and strategies. It's an artwork called That's All Right, Mama, Mama. It's got a curious title, and it's the title of the very first record that Elvis Presley recorded in 1954. And what you see in this image are 2 photographs of the recording studio that Elvis Presley recorded that single in 1954. If we can go to slide 18, Nathan. And those 2 photographs are mounted on this very sort of spatial and strange wall that comes out at you. And not only that, but the photographs they're photographed in sort of old 3D where you can see this sort of, where you have to wear these red and cyan glasses to see them. So what happens is that this work is, I guess, ostensibly about this historical moment, this single that Elvis Presley recorded. But I wanted to kind of capture this moment that was really important to media history and to rock and roll culture and to recorded music history. But I wanted to kind of not to put us within a center of it and not to kind of be able to think of it in terms of a flatness, but to always put us to the side of this history and to kind of maybe allude to how we always see only one perspective of this history, but that history is always composed of multiple moments. It's a kind of a composite history, and allowing viewers to be able to have access or to kind of have a sense that history is very much composed of these other complex moments is a part of this structure of this artwork. If we go to slide 19, this is another artwork that I made around 10 years ago called Several Circles. And what this artwork is composed of is a camera within a car driving alongside a river with a camera on a steamship paddle boat. And what you see in the installation is that they drive down together, filming each other. And the screens present these two points of view side by side. And so ostensibly you have a steam engine, a steam-powered device, facing down a combustion engine, something that replaced it. This whole video installation is set to pounding techno music. And I was interested in putting these kinds of histories in relation to each other, and the kinds of machines, whether it's the steam engine or whether it's the combustion engine or whether it's the drum machine of techno, all into relation together. And several circles alludes to the kinds of histories that kind of orbit each other in this kind of moment. Very quickly, I'd like to move to the next slide, slide 20. And this is just a quick detail of the artwork. And you can see the boat that we filmed to make this artwork. And I'd like to move on to the next artwork, slide 21. And this is another artwork that I made more recently. It's called You Can See the Weakness of a Man Right Through His Iris. I'll just tell you quickly about this piece, which is what you see is a glass sculpture, and it's a sculpture by the artist Jeff Koons, a well-known American artist. But a period in the 80s, he decided to make artworks about his relationship with a porn star, and they were kind of a very famous, well-known set of artworks. But a very curious one that I've always been fascinated with is one that he made in glass, and it's a grotesque kind of sculpture. And it's of him having sex with his ex-wife, Cicciolina. And what I did in this artwork is to use his artwork, this glass sculpture, as a weird kind of camera lens, almost as if we would see through what Jeff Koons would see of the world. And this object of a man's fantasy, and this fantasy of an artist, of Jeff Koons, if you know him, he makes a very kind of fantastical artwork, a kind of hyper capitalist sort of artwork. But I tried to imagine what you would see if you use this artwork to film the world. And so this artwork is actually a 3D animation and made of 3D glass. And what I did was to use that 3D glass to film the world, or film real images. And what you get is this kind of refraction, this kind of distortion, this kind of grotesque, but very, very kind of realistic way the glass distorts views through that. And I'll show you a little bit of how that artwork looks. If you can cue the next slide, Nathan. So what you see here is the installation of the artwork, or a rendering of it, and it's a video that is composed, that is placed on a mirrored panel in a space. Great, and if you can cut back to me, Nathan. This artwork, again, it presents a kind of composite experience, something that is both fantastical, which is this 3D animation of this glass, and of how that animation tries to render the world. And what I like about that, if you can go to the next slide, slide 23, Nathan, is that that refractory element, that thing that glass does, seems to be very much both an element of reality, as well as kind of a sense of fictionalization. So when you see through glass, glass doesn't present things as clear. It distorts it. What you see is a straw that's moved. And so what you see in terms of this artwork is reality bending. and fantasy kind of, in a sense, the space of the fantastical being created. But what again, what the stakes of that to me are how human experience is both again a composite of this bending, this kind of multiplicity of experience. Nathan, if we could go to slide 24. Yeah, so I wanted to kind of end with this image of another artwork that I made of a very specific place that I spent a lot of time with growing up in Canada. And that is Georgia Street at Granville Street. And I was very fortunate to be invited to make a public artwork in this place. And what I made are a series of poems that that relate to what I felt that place, some of the experiences of that place. This artwork is called Cat and Mouse, and they're poems put on this glass wall that are both forward and backwards and reversed and recto verso. And so they're readable from one side of the glass and they're readable from the other side of the glass. And the full meaning of the poem or the full sentence of the, is experienced when you actually get to move between these two sides of the piece. And again, I've used that in this work as a way to kind of highlight the many different kinds of perspectives and experiences that I feel are inherent to this piece and the way that we experience this kind of place. So on that note, I'd like to just kind of close out, and I hope that's kind of given everyone a kind of a brief overview of Twilight on the Edge of Town and my practice in general. And I'd just like to hand that back over to Jordan.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. I mean, there's so much material there to discuss. I mean, it was great to see you talk about the current work in relation to the work in the gallery behind me here. You know, with it here on site, and then also thinking about it in relation to your past earlier work. I guess I have a question connecting in with some of the work you just spoke of. I mean, there's this notion of doubling that reoccurs in your work, like with that's all right, mama, mama, and Monochrome Sunset that you discussed, both those works. And there is a kind of doubling in this piece here with the twin screen, but in many ways I think of it as also sort of being maybe more of a 3 or 4 screen work because there's so much, as you just talked about, the importance of refraction in your work. The floor turns into a screen in many ways, and the back wall of the gallery. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about the idea of immersive space and these multiple screens and that sense of space, because I think it's quite unique, this work, in terms of its use of space on many levels. But you know, and it's in some ways in dialogue with 3D imagery and new forms of stereoscopic virtual reality type cinema in a very different way, almost holographic in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think this kind of doubling, or not just doubling, but multiplication of imagery has been really interesting to me, because it's a way to present, it's a way to say that there are multiple points of view and multiple stakes involved in every image, whether that's from the way that we remember things, or whether that's from what's being depicted in terms of a political or a social sense. I think what I'm interested in is that every image is not, it's not singular in terms of its truth or its effect. What seems interesting to me in terms of human experience is that it's complex, and and more often than not composed of conflicting and multiple kinds of experiences, and trying to capture that kind of complexity, that kind of refractory or prismatic kind of experience, I think seems much more. I think of that as a kind of way to decenter the truthfulness of these kinds of images or experience, or the ability to kind of render them from only one point of view. So I think in all these artworks, I've tried to find forms or structures, I think, that put that in play, or that provide questions to a singular point of view. And whether that's deciding to double images, or to multiply them, or to place them in different aspects of space so that they're not always in front of us and not always directly in front of us, and to tell people that, well, history, events, and future tense, past tense, all these elements are sort of in negotiation all the time. I think using space is a central metaphor for me to kind of describe that kind of experience.
Great, thank you. I guess picking up on that a little bit, this idea of doubling, I mean, you've talked about this a little bit in relation to the sound, but I'm struck just experiencing this work now in sort of physical form for the first time, these double voices in your piece, and in Twilight on the Edge of Town. And you talked a little bit about that connection to Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape, classic work. And it's interesting to see the return of Beckett in many respects in the last year, where we have the pandemic responses in terms of theater, performing arts. But that layering of sound, it's quite striking, because you're drawn to move around in the gallery space in a way to make legible acoustically, I guess, through listening to the sounds of the older voice speaking of the past and the younger voice speaking of the future. And so maybe if you could speak a little bit more about that connection to both Beckett and Glenn Gould. You had mentioned the idea of North, a kind of classic Canadian piece, a radio documentary, where there's a similar layering of sound, because it can be, it really requires some work to sort of pick out some of the words and language and phrases. I think of so many interesting phrases in that. So what were you trying to accomplish, and how did those earlier texts maybe relate to that?
Yeah, I think what I tried to do in the artwork is layer these tenses together, to layer where they're speaking from together, and so that they're kind of understood as happening not as individual moments, but really happening simultaneously. So I want to put the viewer in this position where they're trying to negotiate those kinds of tenses at the same time. And in the installation, you have to move over to one side to listen to what's being talked about more clearly. You have to move over to listen to the child talk about what he'd like to do in the future, and then you have to move over to the other side to listen to the other person trying to remember their past. But what happens is that you're trying to negotiate these 2 points of speaking at the same time, and that negotiation, I think, is what I'm interested in trying to speak about, how we remember things, or how we also try to imagine what things can be. And that's always in relation to what happened and what might happen, and also, I think, from where we're at in the present. I think, as you mentioned, Glenn Gould very much picked up on some of these kinds of ideas and produced his famous The Idea of North, about using some of these techniques, and multiple voices happen, and it was a kind of place, if I remember correctly, he hadn't ever been to. And so this kind of simultaneity of experience of trying to negotiate this very space, this kind of the north of Canada, this space that occupies for many Canadians who live along the American border, for example, a large part of our kind of cultural imagination is bound up in this area, and just trying to kind of negotiate all the voices that might speak of it or what those places might be, I think is really an interesting model.
Thank you. I think we've got some questions coming through here from some audience members. I've got one here from Jonathan Middleton. Hi, Mark. Can you speak to iteration in your work? I'm thinking specifically of how this new work of yours has been developing over a period of time and in an online format, forms of collaboration. So I'm curious to see how this might continue to develop in a future presentation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And as I work more on pieces, I'm interested in works that develop over time. And I talked about theater and about kind of the sort of greater influence of the space that theater might suggest. And by theater, I mean not dramatic theater, but kind of an idea of theater developed through the avant-garde that challenges conventional ideas of what space and can be, and things that occur over time. In this artwork, Twilight on the Edge of Time, I've tried to develop the installation so that things do happen over time and get choreographed across time, and to kind of take that into account. And that's also very much in terms of the development of artworks that maybe don't have a definitive ending point, that can keep on developing and changing and morphing. Part of this artwork is also bound up in a website that I developed with Art Metropole and called Twilight on the Edge of Town, where I give away all of the files that I used, image files that I used for this artwork. And that is available, like I said, as I mentioned, on Twilight and twilightontheedgeoftown.xyz through a BitTorrent system or a peer-to-peer torrent system. And what I was interested in that artwork is dispersing the experience of this through a kind of a collective and shared platform, and through other media that is also very different than this sort of physical and very immersive installation that I'm able to show at Surrey Art Gallery. So the way that an artwork can develop and go from something that is distributed online to something as a full experience, an immersive experience, is aspects of that compositeness that I'm also interested in.
Great, thank you. And then we've got another question here from, let's see, Judy Radul, question about the way you're negotiating realism and fabulation, in addition to the sort of doubling of, and narrative perceptual effects. But in terms of Vancouver photographic tradition, she was saying, that it isn't sort of realism, fiction. It's, let me see if I get this question right. Sort of this relation to a kind of criticism of expressionism. Do you think that in recent visual art, we, quote, smuggle in expressionism through the use of music? Is that happening in your work or in other people's work? Have you noticed?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, yeah, I don't entirely know how to answer that, but I would definitely say that we tend to have these, I don't know, these outlets that we, that we go, that we have or places that we allow ourselves to immerse ourselves in a less, I don't know, I would say the kind of critical position to images and media is something that we, for example, when we listen to pop music, it's definitely one area where somehow we both are critical of the mechanisms of media, but also allow ourselves to be immersed in it and to enjoy the expressionism that might be contained in it. And I think that that contradiction, I think, is an important thing to kind of acknowledge for sure.
Thanks. I think I'm just going to maybe end on I guess another question that I was kind of rolling around in my mind as we prepared for this exhibition. So it struck me as we were developing this project that this show actually comes on the anniversary, well, an anniversary of sorts. It was actually 35 years ago today, just short of a day really, when we presented a work, a two-person exhibition, Stan Douglas and Marion Penner Bancroft, two really influential local artists based in the Metro Vancouver area. And it was called Mechanics of Memory. And your work has all these really, I think, strong resonances on many of the works of both Marion's and Stan's. But I was thinking of one of those is Stan Douglas's Overture, which has become a really important kind of instance of film and moving image moving into the gallery outside of a kind of video installation kind of practice. And it was 60 millimeter film of a shot of a train moving into a tunnel in the Kicking Horse Pass, an old piece of film piece on a loop. And it just struck me that this, with a voiceover by Marcel Proust from his book, Remembrance of Things Past. So very much about memory. And this work of yours is very much about memory as well. And so I was wondering to what extent, your address or thinking about time and memory, like in Douglas's work and others, has shifted during this moment, during this past year, this extraordinary and very sort of challenging time. But this shift in our sense of time has been something that others have remarked on. We did an exhibition earlier this year called Facing Time, which tried to think a little bit about this aspect of the temporal and time shift with the pandemic. How is that this past year shifted this project itself? Because we were going to present it last year, a year ago, this week.
Yeah, it's been kind of incredible to think about how it's sort of also morphed and changed over this time, and what I wanted it to be in April 2020 is definitely not what it is now. And yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to kind of account for that change, but I think you bring in all the worries and stress and anticipation of things happening or could happen or might happen but not happen, to bear on an artwork, and it will morph and it'll change. It's also really interesting that you bring up Overture by Stan and the exhibition at Surrey Art Gallery. And Overture in particular, I think, is really interesting because I think it's not, for me at least, it's not a work just about memory, but it's also about as much about thinking or anticipating what's coming ahead. And in the artwork, as you mentioned, a train goes through a tunnel. It hurtles forward at a very, very high velocity and speed with a camera placed in front. And this was found footage that Stan used. But at the same time, you hear a voiceover disconnected from the image about somebody remembering, again, recollecting. And what that piece has, again, is this forward momentum combined with something recalling the past. And you as a viewer stand in front of that screen and have to kind of negotiate both of these two directions at the same time. As I think, as you've mentioned, it seems to me a metaphor about how in all times, but definitely now, how we try to make sense of what it means and what time means and what we have to do in it.
Well, it is an extraordinary work, Mark. It really is. It even exceeded my expectation. I'm really excited and thrilled to have this work finally being presented here. to our community and audiences. And we are going to be doing various, some programming online for those who are not able to make it in. We have very safe conditions for people to come safely, and you just need to book through the website or stay tuned to our channels for more programming around the project. So I want to sincerely thank you, Mark, for this is many years of work and for producing such an extraordinary work of art. I also want to thank a few other people who made today's event possible. But before that, I want to acknowledge our funders, the BC Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Surrey Art Gallery Association, and City of Surrey. I also especially want to acknowledge the New Chapters Grant program from Canada Council, recognizing 200 major projects coming out of the 150th anniversary, the sesquicentennial. That was in a very important way that this was able to happen. I also want to mention that we're going to be co-publishing a catalog along with the German publisher Verleichkeit Books later this year, which we're really excited about if you're interested in learning more about this piece. So I want to thank some people who made this event possible. First off, I want to mention and thank Cecily Nicholson, our event coordinator, Alana Edwards and Savi Baines, our event support, Alison Raja, our event supervisor and gallery director, Nathan Douglas, our technician. Thank you, Nathan. And of course, I want to thank all of you who spent time today tuning in and listening to this wonderful presentation. And I hope you have a pleasant and safe rest of your day. Take care.